Welcome to part 2 of how to build a custom control arm. So, if you're curious about how we got to anything in this episode that was not covered, I almost guarantee you it was covered in part 1. So, if you skipped over all of that and you got a question about stuff that we covered in part 1, I'm going to send you right back to part 1. There's a lot to learn in there. So, anyway, this one's all about the fabrication of it, the welding of it, the setting it all up, getting it stuck together, throwing it on the car, and everything else like that in between. So, let's get on it. So in part 1, we went through all of this 2D layout, and this is the part that we need to make. That's what this episode's all about. So let's pick up right where we left off. Now this is where I usually see people kind of making a big mistake about where they pull their measurements from, because I mean you got to know which one to actually gather the measurements and the length and width and all the rest of that stuff from. Otherwise you're going to be off by a very significant amount. So understanding which one you need to pull measurements from, or which one is correct, or which side you're viewing, or which plane you're on and all that, that's where it gets a little bit tricky. But I'm going to try and walk you through this one, and it should make sense. Now the first part that we're going to measure and cut out is our side plane, is the part from our side plane. Now these parts are pretty much identical as far as their measurements are concerned, so we're just going to knock this one out really easy. In order to get our correct length and width, we need to measure both planes. The top plane will give us our correct length of the part. The reason why is because the part tapers, and that tapered distance is not shown on the side plane for the length of our part. So our full length, we're going to add up each one of these lines. We've got 1 1/4 inches. We're going to add an additional inch to it for notch clearance, 1 3/4 inches for the pocket, and 6 1/4 inches for the tail end. Remember that this goes past our theoretical termination point with the additional inch that we gave to it. So do not measure to your actual theoretical termination point, go to the extension. That will be our total length of our part. Now the total width of the part we're going to pull from the side plane, because on the top it's not illustrated. We have nothing to measure. We only have the width of the pocket on the top plane. So in this case, it's 2 3/4 inches. My sheet metal of choice, 1/8 inch steel. Now I know a lot of you guys asked for the math and the calculations to figure out what it is that you need and all the rest of the stuff, and I've said it a dozen times over. There's so much that goes into this. It would be like hours and hours and hours worth of video, and yeah, so I did the math on this one, and I could have come up with about 1/10 of an inch, or maybe even like an 0.95 thickness. I could have easily gotten away with it based on the actual designs, but I'm just going to use 1/8 inch because that's what I have laying around. This is hot rolled steel, and it's been pickled and oiled, which you can usually get what they call P&O metal. I don't normally care for working with hot roll when I'm doing TIG welding. Even though it's been the mill scale's been removed and I cleaned it up 1,000 times, you'll notice that it's kind of gets a little junky when you weld it, or at least when you TIG weld it. If you MIG it, you'll never really notice a difference. But I much prefer using cold roll. But all I have is hot roll P&O on hand right now. So that's just, it is what it is. We're going to cut 2 pieces of it, and then we're going to tack them together before we do our layout. The reason why we can get away with it now is because both pieces are exactly the same dimension. They just break a different direction on each side. Now, my original plan was just to show you that, how I laid this out and all the rest of the stuff, but I think I really need to run over and really stress this part about where your measurements are pulled from, because the same method that we use to pull our measurements or gather the information from our measurements is the same way we need to lay it out, or the measurements we need for the layout when we actually translate this onto the sheet metal itself. So remember, the length comes from the top plane. Those are the lengths that we need. The width of the part, and now including the spacing of the bolt holes, needs to come from the side plane. Also remember, at the same time, we added an additional inch to our part for the notch where it goes around the bushing housing. Now this is where it gets tricky. Where do you actually start from? On this, as we essentially have 2 points that make a 90-degree angle. That's the top of our side plane and the extension of the termination point. Up top in the left corner there, they form a 90-degree angle, which means we have a great place to start from the top and measure down, and from the left to measure right. This will give us very accurate measurements. Now you'll also see me adding an additional 1/4 inch to the bottom of the bushing housing, and that's for the metal to have something to weld to, just in case. It might get trimmed down later, it might stay there, who knows. It's just a little added assurance here. I'm also going to notch out or make clearance for the pilot bit of the hole saw. The reason why is because the bushing housing is the exact size, or the hole saw that we're going to use is a 2-inch hole saw, and we need clearance for that pilot bit in there because half of it would theoretically be in the way. So just a quick notching out of there to get out of the way. Then we're going to back in with the hole saw, get it completely notched out, followed up with a 12mm drill. This will pop out our holes for our strut mount. And remember, in part 1, we actually added a drop hole to it to notice a 1-inch suspension drop from the factory. So this second hole, or at least that bottom one, not necessary by design, but I added it. Next comes all the cutout work. Now, one thing I did do was kind of cut into the brake reference only slightly, and you'll see a close-up of that in a moment here, but I did that so I have my visual reference when the marker lines go away. Remember, we only marked out one side, so getting them right on the other side after we've got it all cut out and everything is going to be difficult, so I just notched into them just a tiny bit. Then I'm going to chase it out with a flap disc. This is just going to clean up the edges, make it all nice and pretty like, and if you want to give yourself a pretty good chuckle, watch how many times throughout this video that I grind the faces or grind on this part. It's kind of only funny when you realize that no matter what you do to it, being that this is hot rolled steel, it's still going to weld like crap. So either way, just going to keep that in the back of your head. Now, angles. We need to figure out what our angles need to be, obviously. So one quick way to do this is to grab a protractor. Now, this is just a little protractor angle finder thingy that works out pretty well. It gets us pretty close, or at least in the ballpark. The first angle we're measuring out comes out to 10 degrees. This second angle we're measuring out comes out to 25 degrees. And remember that these pieces are mirrored of each other, so one has to bend one way, one has to bend the other way, or the opposite direction. So we're going to make a reference while they're mirrored as to which end is up. Now I'm going to run over to the sheet metal brake. This is my Eastwood 48-inch box and pan sheet metal brake. It is rated at 16 gauge full sheet, but it will happily do small parts like this 1/8 inch. It's not really rated for it, so don't expect the greatest quality of that because you're really stretching it, but either way. 25 degrees on the first side. I'm going to double check it here with my protractor. Looks like we're coming out dead on where we need to be. And 10 degrees is literally just a bump. And in this case, I bumped it. I know I bumped it a little bit too much. So when I measure it out, I'm literally sitting about roughly, 15, 20-ish. And you got to keep on stepping it back down or pushing it back down only slightly to get it just right at 10 degrees, which it's literally the slightest amount. So now we can set it back up into our fixture. Yes, I said fixture, not jig, but either way. We throw it back up in here and notice that we have an interference issue. It won't actually let me fit it where it needs to go. This angle looks like it comes up short, but it's actually because it's interfering with that lower point there. So just a quick trimming with the grinder. Now let's talk about that real quick, about fixtures versus jigs. I know the difference. I know a lot of people are grilling me for that one, but I usually build jigs. I know that this is technically by definition a fixture, but jig is more universally known or spoken, or all the rest of that stuff. It's one of those things, like, it's not really that big of a deal to call it a jig or a fixture. So since I used to build jigs, like actual jigs, to do work inside of them without just holding parts together, I call them jigs still, and most other people do. So that's fixed. Let's put it back up in here and see how we look. And if I take a quick look at this, I don't really care for how close they are together on the bushing housing. Looks like my 1/4 inch was just a little bit overkill. I know I can squeeze in with like an 1/8 inch of area in there. I can still squeeze on a really good solid pass on there, and I'm not going to worry too much about it. So it looks like I'm going to have to expand these just a little bit. And with expanding them, we'll increase our stability only slightly, which I'd like that to happen. So this is, there's kind of a little bit of massaging, a lot of feel that goes into this. We're going to grab a hold of a BFH on the edge of my table, and I'm just going to smack that brake doan a little bit. If you place it where the brake is pretty much braced on 2 points with a peak above them, and you smack it down pretty hard, or at least hard enough to make it move only slightly, we can put it back up in here each time, take a look at where we land on it, and as soon as I'm content with it, we'll be good to go. Now it's time to measure the top and the bottom parts. Now notice that we have two separate lengths, the length of the top part and the length of the bottom part. We have the same width of each part, which we have width A and width B, and we're basing everything off of our center line from the top plane. This is how we're going to get all of these marked out on here. Now since we are running from our break points, you notice that the length of the pocket up top that we marked out has to actually be the correct length of it, or it actually has to be that size for clearance. But since we're running to our break points, which are located a 1/2 inch inward on the pocket, we have to create a notch. The notch depth, or the distance of that radius from the break point to the actual edge where it needs to be, is also what we need to mark out here. So don't forget to mark out your 1/2 inch, and this is where we're going to set it up with the hole saw. So the depth of that radius, or the depth of that hole, or half a hole, or whichever portion of it that we have to cut out, will be up to that point for the actual length of the pocket. Now these plates that I'm stacking up that we're going to cut it out of, these are two separate lengths. Remember that we have two separate length parts, but I'm going to stack them on top of each other and I'm going to tack them together because I want to make sure that I cut out each notch in the exact same spot. So the top and the bottom parts have to have the same notch cut in them. Now when it comes to measuring it out, there is a difference in length between the two of these, so when it comes to measuring them out and marking them for my cut references, I have to measure and mark both pieces or both parts. The difference in length between each piece is only 1/4 of an inch, but that will make a big difference when it comes to where they actually land and terminate on the tail end, where they're all supposed to go together. So again, remember, mark out the top, mark out the bottom, and the two edges where they actually made up is where our notch is going to go. But look at both sides, they look pretty similar, but they're actually a little bit different. Now, following the golden rule, we can always take metal away, but we can't necessarily put it back on. I switched my hole saw size down to 1.75 inches, which means if I need to widen it just a little bit, I can expand it with the grinder. No big deal. But once the notch is already cut out, I'm going to separate the two pieces and cut them individually again with the grinder. Then I'm going to clean them all up and get them ready to stick onto the actual part. Now, when it comes to placing the top and bottom parts on, there are two things that you need to remember. One, don't get them mixed up. Remember that these are two separate lengths and there's only 1/4 inch difference. So remember which one is the top and which one is the bottom. In this case, the short one goes on top, the long one goes on the bottom. The second thing, you may have to actually tweak and stretch it just a little bit, but you want to make sure that it stays central or it stays lined up right down the center of it. So if you do have to pull off one side or the other just to tweak it around a little bit, you're good to go. It really helps to place the part on one side and one side only first. Get it tacked up and then you can stretch the other side. Also, don't weld it to the bearing housing until you have at least one part attached. The reason why is in case you need to take one side off of it to stretch it out or bang it back together or make any kind of changes to it. It'll be a lot easier to do that without it being attached to the bearing housing. So as soon as I have some good solid tacks on here, at least 3 of them on each side, we can then attach it to the bearing housing and then I can pull it out of the jig and put the bottom part on. Also remember to take your time. If you're anything like me, you want to get in a rush because you want to hurry up and weld it, and that can be a bad thing. So take your time, be picky about it. Be very picky about it, in fact. Now, by design, we have a square to round transition, and a lot of people asked, how are we going to cut this and get the round part to go through it? It's really simple. The tubing diameter we're using is 1.25 inches. Therefore, it needs to be an 1.25 inch round hole that needs to be cut into the square part. The best way to guide this or get this in is by using a tube that has the same inside diameter as the hole saw outside diameter. This will serve as a guide. If we get it tacked onto the tail end of it and send it right up the middle, we'll have our transition cut. Now when you cut this way and actually get like into the sides of the actual metal without cutting a real hole, it tends to want to bite and fight you and grab and flip and all the rest of that stuff. You can try using a clamp to hold it down on the table, but I tend to actually run with a very loose grip and I just let the hole saw do the work. That way it won't fight you as much, but if it does grab and flip over or anything else like that, you got to be kind of ready for it. If you use it with a clamp, it could pull the part away and destroy it, so use your best discretion on this one and do whatever it is that you're most comfortable with. Now once our hole saw has gone all the way through, and I literally mean all the way through, we're going to need to chase it out with a flap disc. Now you can visually see on the inside when you look at it that there's some thin spots and you can see where the profile is created or what you actually need to remove. But be very careful, let the flap disc do all the work, not your muscles, and make sure that you don't go overboard with that profile. It's very imperative that you just, look at it. You can visually see it and you can kind of get a feel for it and all the rest of that, but just make sure you don't go overboard. If you do go overboard, you're going to have some very big gaps to contend with. So, at the end of all of this, you can see all of that 2D layout and everything that we did got us the part that we needed, and now all we really got to do is find our tube and stick it all together. Now, in order to get our correct tube length and measure it all out, we're going to need to throw all this right back into the jig again. So, very simple. We'll stick it back in here. I'm going to take a measurement from the bung and run it all the way up to the point where the pocket opens up at the notch. In this case, we have 10 inches of length. That's the length of our tube. My tube of choice, 1.25 inches with a 120 wall DOM. This is what it calculates to, and of course, maybe one of these days we'll get into all the engineering on it, but not right now. But as a general rule, the thickness of the original part should also be, at bare minimum, the thickness of the new part. However, if your design is dramatically different than what the original design was, or not even close to it, you could be losing a lot of structure, and it really doesn't matter what you make it out of, because Yeah. So like I said before, there's so many different things that go into calculating the design of a part and all the rest of that stuff. That's why there's no universal answer. There's no yes or no. There's no black or white to it. It's all very, very calculated for the exact part that you're building, which is quite often why I don't share a lot of that information, because what I do for this part in this video at this time may not be the same as what you need to do for your part on your chassis, which is a totally different design. I hope that's making sense. So anyway, process. That's something else that we need to pay attention to on this one. You'll see here that as we slide the tube onto the inside, there is no structure. There is no point at which this tube will mate to anything other than the body at the tail end. That has no structure to it. So we're going to need to add a bulkhead to it. However, therein lies another problem. We have no way to access the inside of the tube to weld it if we were going to butt the tube up to the bulkhead. Therefore, we must add a through hole to our bulkhead, which will allow us to weld the end of the tube to the bulkhead from the inside of the pocket. Now we have to pay attention to where we actually weld and what we weld in which order, because in any point where that tube is welded in, it will stay in. There will be absolutely no way to remove it once we have any kind of weld or tack on it. So after some very careful measurements to measure the point at which the tube protrudes through is very difficult actually, because this is in the section where it tapers down. There's no way to gain access to the inside to measure it. Therefore, I'm going to measure the outside at a theoretical line where it intersects with the tube and the tube can protrude through. Then I'm going to subtract the thickness of the sheet metal on each side. This will give me my exact dimension. The same thing is going to happen for measuring from the top to the bottom, or the length of the piece. Then it's just a matter of finding out where the hole needs to be, cutting it out, and getting it all set in there. Now, in order to make sure that it's actually set correctly where it needs to be back in the jig. So as soon as I have it all set up, just the same way as it was before, and I verify the position of it and verify access. Now, the things that I need to access is, one, I need to access the sides of the bulkhead so I can weld it to the actual housing itself, and I need to make sure that the protrusion of the tube is correct as well. This is important because we need something to weld it all to. This is where all of our structure comes in. Now, as soon as I've verified it and I like it, I'm going to tack the bulkhead, just tack. I'm going to tack the bulkhead to the sides of the housing. Not the tube, but just the bulkhead. Then I'm going to go to the back of the tube and tack the tube itself to the bung. I'm going to get at least 3 tacks on here so it doesn't move. At this point, the tube is still removable, and it needs to be. There is one more thing I want to do to the contour of this squared around, and that's just kind of make it a little bit smoother. In order to achieve that, I'm going to use the cutoff wheel and just throw a very small slit right here at the tail end of it. What this will do is actually increase the gap between the sheet metal, which I can go back in after it's fitted back up to the tube and in the jig again. I can go back in and just kind of tap it and form it and then grind it and kind of shape it to make that transition a little bit smoother. This is absolutely not necessary. It's just one of those little extra things that I like to do with my work to make it look a little bit smoother, just a little bit more, I don't know, attention to detail, I guess you could say. It's just, maybe it's just a pride thing. But as soon as I have the shape and I like it, I'm going to go ahead and tack the tube to the bulkhead. This means that everything is ready for prep again before I actually go and weld the bulkhead, because at this point the tube's no longer removable because it's been tacked in many places. Now, I'm going to weld the bulkhead completely and weld the tube to the bulkhead. Now, I mentioned before, I'm not a big fan of using hot rolled, and the reason why you can see is it burns through a nice little mill scale or a scale that comes up, oxidation, whatever you want to call it, starts building up on the other side. And once you actually try to weld this, when I do the outside corners a little bit later to fully weld this housing together, it's going to weld like crap in that area, then it's going to smooth out. But every single time I weld it, well, you'll just see it. Either way. As soon as it's done welding, I'm going to grind it all back down again on the outside and prep it up one more time before we actually get to putting on the other caps on the opposite side where the bearing housing is. Now, if you remember earlier, we slightly modified the actual ends where the bearing housing goes, and they're not at the same angle as they were before. They have changed. Therefore, we cannot use our 2D layout in order to get the size of this part or the exact fit that it needs to be at. Now, we can get close, of course, but I'm going to rely instead on a moldy oldie but goodie trick with some masking tape, and we're just going to literally just stick it on in a few places, get it nice and sturdy and rigid, and then trace it out and cut it with a razor blade. As soon as we transfer this onto our piece of steel and mark it out, we have the exact size that it needs to be in order to weld it. Now, another one of those handy-dandy tricks that I like to pass on to a lot of people is you notice that we have a rather interesting shaped part, and we still need to create the notches for the actual pocket itself, for the clearance of the strut. But since we have such oddly shaped pieces here, we can't necessarily throw them into a vise squarely and expect them to hold. So grab a hold of some locking pliers, stick the two pieces on top of each other where they need to be, toss it up into the vise, and you're good to go. This also works for grinding them out or shaping them or doing anything else that you need to, which makes life a lot easier. So just grab some locking pliers, vice grips as we call them here is the brand name, or whatever it is that you have, chuck them up in there and you're good to go. So with our two caps complete now, we're on to home stretch. Let's get these things tacked on here, formed up, and sitting right where they need to be. And you can see the whole arm is basically taking shape now, and I'm also getting myself in a rush. I need to slow down. Just a reminder, don't get yourself in a rush. Make sure that everything fits in here right where it needs to be. Of course, we have two different length parts now, and we got to make sure that we have one correctly on the top, one correctly on the bottom, and whichever way that they fit best is the way you need to stick them in there and make sure that the fit is near perfect. Remember, any kind of gaps or anything like that will slow you down on your weld, and it's not going to look that good. Speaking of weld, that's all we have left to do here. My favorite part. And what better place to start than on these caps themselves? Now, the majority of this whole piece here is outside corners, and if your outside corner game sucks, you might want to take some practice time on some other pieces or something like that, or especially if your part has a lot of outside corners like this one does. You know, little practice pieces, you know, grab some scrap metal or something like that, and then, you know, run a few of them, so that way you get some decent looks. Now, aside from chasing the strength here, I want some really nice coinage. I want to see some good stacks laying down, but here's one of the problems that we have working with hot rolled. In the beginning there, we're in that heat affected zone where the metal was already beat to hell from the other welds or welding the inside of it. Hot roll steel, or A36, typically has an issue running it. And of course, when you start welding on it, it doesn't usually come out looking pretty. It comes out a little bit grainy, not that fantastic looking. It's one of the things I really like running with cold roll. But here's, again, you can see in the beginning here, when we start running this bead, it's a little bit of a hassle. It doesn't seem to want to stack right, and as soon as we clear it, it's nothing but coins. Now check this out. If you can look kind of carefully here, and you can see a little bit of a hazy line about where the bulkhead sits. I'm going to highlight it here. Now everything around that area, that heat affected zone of the metal around that, which I'll show here in the brackets in red, was a problematic area. As soon as we cleared it, then it was smooth sailing. That happened on every single joint, except for ones which didn't have a heat affected zone that we had to weld through, like on the front here. It's just kind of one of those things that bugs me. And it's really the reason why I usually use cold roll steel for fabricating all this stuff instead of hot roll. Even though there's no mill scale on it, even though we prepped it up, it still just doesn't come out looking like the best. And of course, dealing with that heat problem, that's, it's just one of those things. But either way, I'm not going to complain about it. I'm just going to run it, do my thing, and you know what? It never hurts to practice anyway. And realistically speaking, this is not a piece that I'm going to use. It's just one that I'm using for this episode. You'll see the car that it actually sits on. But pretty much everything else is very smooth. Running everything from the tube up to the actual sheet metal itself, pretty smooth sailing. I'm pretty happy with that. Of course, running this bung here, this tube end, this is nice and smooth either way you slice it. We'll have behind the lens and in regular shot and everything else like that. It's stacking up just beautifully. This is the way, because all of this right here is essentially cold roll, and that's why I love welding cold roll. It doesn't come out looking all crappy. It comes out looking really good. But either way, everything I'm going to do on this one is single pass. We're not worried about like super hardcore strength requirements or anything. And I could have thrown in a rosette weld on the end of it, but I chose not to on this one just because it's, granted, I've seen stuff like that fail before without the rosette weld, but it's not one of those things that I'm not gonna trip about on this part. The car that it's going on weighs practically nothing. So then getting into the bearing housing here, pretty smooth, nothing really fancy, but you can see it's kind of grainy looking, when it comes around to the actual sheet metal side of it. And of course, we're welding to some cold roll. That bearing housing is cold roll, so everything nice and smooth, stacks up pretty well. I'm content with it. I'm satisfied with it. It should do the job here. Now, a lot of people like to know about settings and stuff like that, and I don't remember all of my settings, but it did change. My outside corners were probably about 120 amps, and I'm a hot and heavy kind of welder anyway. I just flew through them. Pretty sure I bumped up to about 140 or so on the bung, and of course on the bearing housing there, it was likely closer to like 150, 160 or so. I mean, I usually only weld based on what I can see, but, I'm looking at the part and everything like that. Everything's pretty cool, aside from the fact that it's a little hazy around each one of those welds for the outside corners on the hot roll. I really don't like that. Maybe I'm beating myself up, but, it'll hold. Everything's cool. Even if we powder coated it or even ground them down or whatever, I mean, it looked just fine, realistically. I decided to install it with the strut in the bolt hole, in the drop hole. That way you can see the clearances we have. Now this is at maximum extension, and of course at maximum compression we would have a little bit less than the same clearance. It actually wouldn't even come close because the strut would bottom out or the car would hit or whatever beforehand. So a lot of people asked for that shot, and that's what we got. So this is pretty much what it looks like, and that's how you build it. Pretty simple. Now that is going to wrap it up for this episode, and I want to thank you guys for watching as always. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell for more really awesome content. And you know what, I still have some more, maybe more control arm videos up my sleeve. Plus the other stuff that we got to get to. But anyway, if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and drop them down in the comments box below. If you need to get in contact with us, hit us up on the fabricationseries.com website, Instagram at the.fabricator, or facebook.com/thefabricatorseries. I will catch you guys on the next episode. Jig!